I would like to start with the courthouse in Mesilla, where Billy was tried. Is there anyone here that has not been to Mesilla and seen the courthouse? So we've all seen the courthouse. This is more or less what it looks like now. This picture is a couple years old, so they've changed a little bit the painting on the door and so on. Notice that the corner of the building is cut off. That's the entrance today. This is what it looked like about 1920. You can see that the corner was not cut off. That was not the entrance. The entrance was on this side, the second door on this side. If you look at it very closely, do you see the bricks? You see the walls made out of bricks? This has actually fooled some very serious historians. That's painted on there. Of course, it's adobe. And I've actually seen some historians saying, well, we thought it was made out of adobe. What happened was the Lopez family, who had a bar at Elephant Butte, moved down here. They opened their bar in the building. They called it the Elephant Butte Bar. And it was kind of a fashion at the time to paint bricks on adobe walls. There was at least one other place in Mesilla that it was done. And so, but it has fooled a lot of people. Now, I want you to notice the building along the right. I'm going to show you a diagram in a minute. This takes up this entire block. We'll see a diagram of it in the middle. Those windows and doors you see going off on the right, there was an office in there for the sheriff and an office in there for the jailer. And then at the far back part, that fell down. That's now replaced with a two-story building. That's actually where the jail was inside of Placita, and we'll see that here. This is the Lopez family. And again, this is the door. This is going to be on the right side. You can see the elephant there on the left. And this was taken about 1910. They sold the business about 1917 or 1915. This is a picture from the 60s. It was a bar then. Right next to it, the place to the next to it where it says Liquors, that's actually the Gamboa building, and my friend here, Bob Gamboa, it was his grandfather that built that building. Back then it was a liquor store. I don't know if you knew that or not, Bob. Okay, so now we're looking at the block. You see the plaza on your left. That means at the top of the plaza is where the church is. And you can see the bandstand in the center of the plaza. That's the entire block. It was originally divided into 5 lots. The bottommost lot is the lot that has the courthouse in it, and the courthouse went all the way to the end of the block. Now this is a close-up. You see the little roof section on the left. That's the actual courthouse. Now, you can see there's the room section on the left, which is the courthouse, and then there's a building to the right of that, or a roof to the right of that. That's original. And then the next one is partly original, and then the one on the end is now a 2-story building, and that's quite new, dating from the 70s. And at the bottom, of course, at the bottom is going to be the La Posta restaurant. This is what it looked like approximately when Billy was tried. Notice that, I don't know whether you noticed it or not, but anyway, the window on the right, on the wall on the right, that was turned into a door later on when it was the Elephant Butte thing. The real door is on the left there. At that time there were trees surrounding around the plaza. And it was very bad shape. It was built in 1867, and this is 1883, or 1883. And it's, only about 20 years old, but it's already in very bad condition. Now, what happened was that in 1881, the legislature moved the county seat from Mesilla to Las Cruces. And a couple years later, they built the courthouse in Las Cruces. There was a big fight because Mesilla was caught by surprise. They didn't expect to lose the county seat, and so they fought the building of the new courthouse for quite a while. But by this time, the courthouse is in terrible condition. Okay, so What I'd like to read to you is the quote. A woman named Kathleen Stowes was a student. When the building was not being used as a courthouse, it was used as a primary school. And of course, that was most of the time because the court only met there 3 times a year. The rest of the time, it was a primary school. So Kathleen Stowes was a student, a young student in the school, and this is what she said about it, and I'm hoping I can see it to read it. At the back end of the room is a small platform on which are a table and chair for the judge. On either side of the platform is a small table with 2 chairs. In one corner of the back wall is a large bookcase with the glass missing from one door. At the other corner is a stove in front of the fireplace. There's no other furniture in the room except 16 or 18 wooden benches without backs. In front of the desk was a small clearance where the lawyers came to make their pleas. So this is what the courthouse was set up when Billy was tried. Now, this is a diagram of it, so you can get a very good idea, because when you go into the building now, you really can't tell how it was laid out. So you can see on the very far left is the courthouse, the actual courthouse part, and remember we looked at that little segment of the roof. It's fairly narrow. There's the benches. The students sat on the benches. There's the desk. There's a couple of tables in front for the lawyers. There's the bookcase. There's the fireplace. And when the court session was held, the jury sat in the first 2 rows of benches, and the spectators sat in the rest of the benches. Then attached to it was a placita that was covered, they had a wall around it that was about 11 or 12 feet high. And you can see the 2 offices there in the front part of it. One of them was for the sheriff and one for the jailer. They both lived there. Then the jail was actually 2 rooms, a separate 2-room adobe at the far end of the placita where the 2-story building is now. And when Billy was arrested, there was already 13 prisoners in there. There was no running water. They brought in a bucket for water. The toilet, as you can see, was outside in the placita. And the access, you could get to the placita through the courthouse, but they always brought the prisoners through that back gate in the back of the wall. So if you want to take an opportunity, if you walk around the side of the courthouse building now and go to the back, you can see there's an alley there that's partially open. And that was open the entire way to the plaza when the courthouse was in operation. And then the Gamboa family bought it, and they built a structure in the first part of it. And that blocks the first part, but you can certainly walk around now and see the alley. A very good friend of mine, Joe Lopez, drew this. You can see the bookcase in the back. This is the trial of Billy the Kid. Billy standing in front of the desk. The judge, Judge Bristol, we'll talk about him in a minute, is sitting behind the desk. The sheriff is there. A guard is there. There's a spittoon. There's a number of little details. Joe's family, his great uncle, was actually on the jury that convicted Billy the Kid. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago. He died very young. He was a remarkable artist. He was a remarkable historian. And this is one of his legacies. Now, I told you at the back of that lot, where the 2-story building is now, it fell down. And this is a picture of the ruins before, of course, it was used for a later building. Okay, so now let's get to the actual trial. The exhibit here goes into the details of the Lincoln County War and so on, so we're not going to talk about that, but we're going to start with the capture of Billy the Kid. So Billy was captured by Pat Garrett, excuse me, who had been elected as sheriff just for that reason, essentially. And he captured Billy on the 29th, and there were several other men that were captured with him. I don't know how much we want to go into the story, but one of the interesting aspects of the story is that in the Rock House with Billy the Kid was Pickett and Wilson and Rudaba and Beaudry. And they were surrounded that late at night, and the snow was about 6 feet deep, about 6 feet deep, 6 inches deep. And Beaudry walks out, and Pat Garrett thinks it's Billy the Kid, and they all open up on him and they kill him without any kind of warning. So then Billy and one of the other men had brought their horses into the building, and so that they could escape. There was only one entrance. We'll see it here in a minute. The others were tied out in front. They were trying to bring the other horses into the building in order to basically make a break for it, and Pat Garrett shot the horse, and it fell down in the doorway of the building, and it blocked the doorway. And later on, a man was able to see the skeleton was still there a few years later. Now, Billy was betrayed. Manuel Brazil was a very good friend of his at one point. And he made these extraordinary efforts. He turned against Billy. He made these extraordinary efforts to get Billy captured. You can see there from the text and so on. Brazil was Portuguese from the Azores, which is an island off Portugal. It still is a Portuguese colony. Oddly enough, about a third of the people that lived there, their last name is Brazil. So that's probably where the name of Brazil came from. I never actually looked into it. But you had snow on the ground. He makes all these round trips to tell Pat Garrett where Billy is. He's essentially the man who's responsible for Billy getting captured. Now, as you know, you can argue both sides as to whether or not Billy was a decent person or not, what crimes. But as I'm going to be able to show you, his trial was totally rigged. So in that sense, if there's justice has to be applied equally, and if it's not applied equally, there is no justice. This is the rock house I mentioned at Stinking Springs. Only the door was the entrance. There weren't any windows. When Billy and the other men were surrounded in there before they decided to surrender, they tried to chip through the back of the building, and the sheriff's posse, Pat Garrett's posse, noticed that. They fired at them, and they fired into the building. And as I told you fairly early, they had shot one of the horses that was tied in front. There were two tied in front, two inside, and that fell in the doorway. It blocked the doorway, and Billy in an interview actually said, I would have been able to escape if it hadn't been for that door, that horse in the door. Now, I mentioned that someone visited in 1884, and he was able to see that the skeleton was still stretched across the doorway. This is what it looks like today. And it's an amazing experience to visit there, particularly since it was only on the fourth time I tried to find it that I was able to find it. So when I did finally find it, I was very, very pleased. It's on private land. You have to have permission to visit the site, and it's very difficult to find. You can see the outline of the building there. After Billy was captured, they spent Christmas Day in Puerto de Luna. And this is a picture of the store where they were held. And it was owned by a guy named Grzelowski, or Grzelachowski. It's a Portuguese name, a Polish name, very hard to say. He's supposedly the person with the bowler, or the derby. The building still stands. That's what it looks like today. If you're looking for somewhere to go in New Mexico, consider Puerto de Luna. It's down below Santa Rosa. It's not on a main highway. You have to go south of Santa Rosa. At one time, it was the capital of that county. It's the most amazing place to visit. It really is. The house is on private property, and you have to have special permission to visit it, but you can look over the fence, and you can certainly see it. So after they're captured, they're taken first to Las Vegas, to jail, and then they're taken to Santa Fe. And Garrett had promised that he would take him to Santa Fe. Now, one of the men that was captured with Billy was Dave Rudaba, who was also known as Dirty Dave because they said he never changed his clothes and he stank. He had been involved in the killing of a jailer earlier in Las Vegas, and he was scared to death of being lynched. And that's one reason that they made Garrett promise to take him to Santa Fe, because if he'd left him in jail in Las Vegas, they would have been lynched, or at least he would have been lynched for sure. And in fact, when Garrett put them on the train to take him from Las Vegas to Santa Fe, a crowd of 50 men, led by a deputy sheriff, gathered around the train, and they wanted to take them off the train and lynch them. And the engineer would refuse to drive the train, so Garrett contacted a friend of his that had to come in from Santa Fe, and they had to wait in the train until he showed up, and then he was the one that drove the train to Santa Fe. And of course, the prosecuting attorney, whose name was Reinerson, Billy, the crime for which Billy's going to be tried, as you'll see, was committed in Lincoln County. And territorial law required that that's where the trial be. But the district attorney for the district got the judge, who was biased, to transfer the trial to Mesilla. And that's why the trial was held in Mesilla. And he has this we have this document where he says, Billy will be acquitted if he's tried in this county. And because people knew the circumstances surrounding everything. And in Mesilla, they pretty much didn't. And so that's the first thing they did to ensure that Billy was convicted. This is the jail in Santa Fe. It no longer stands. This is the person that was sheriff in Mesilla when Billy was delivered to Mesilla. Southwick, very interesting person. He was a contractor for the trains when the trains were building across the east and the west, and when they came together, he was one of the men that drove the gold spike when the two branches of the train came together. So there were two charges against Billy. One charge was for killing Buckshot Roberts, and that had occurred on Blazer's Mill. And Billy was really not involved in that. He was present, and if he'd been convicted to that, it would have been a real travesty. But that was one of the two murder charges that was against him. Well, his lawyer, Blazer's Mill was private land on the Mescalero Indian Reservation, and the charge was a federal charge because of the Mescalero Reservation. Well, in the court, Billy's lawyer argued that that was wrong. It was a jurisdictional problem. It was private, even though it was on the reservation, it was private land on the reservation. The deposing attorney objected, but the judge ruled that was the case. So that particular charge was dismissed. And as I said, that would have been a real travesty if he'd actually been tried for that. The other one was for the killing of Sheriff Brady in Lincoln. And this is a really complicated situation. As we'll see, Billy was railroaded in the trial. It was impossible to prove that Billy had actually killed Brady, although it was known that Brady was killed. Now, that was a territorial charge, of course, because it occurred on territory, not federal land. This is what Blazer's Mills looked like then. Of course, it doesn't stand anymore. The killing occurred on the back side of the building. You can't see it. It's around the corner to the right. Okay, so this is a very brief description of the killing of Brady. And as you can see there, it occurred on March 31st. The Lincoln County War was going on. The leader of Billy's side in the war was Alexander McSween. He had been railroaded in a very complicated legal case involving some money that he had succeeded in, some insurance money he had succeeded in getting back after a trip to New York. And both sides were shooting at the other on sight. The court opened, he decided he was going to come into Lincoln, appear in the court, and try to clear his name. Well, like I say, they were shooting at him, the other side was shooting at him on sight, and so these 6 men came into Lincoln the night before, and they were there to try to protect McSween so he could get through the town and get to the courthouse. And that's the reason they were there. And there were 6 initially, and then they were joined by 2 others. Then at 8 o'clock, Sheriff Brady and his deputies included George Pepin, which we'll talk about here in a moment, they began walking down the center of Lincoln. And they knew that McSween was coming into town, and various sources say that they intended to arrest him, or they intended to kill him in the process of arresting him. It's a little bit unclear. As they walked past Tunstall's store, the corral that was surrounding Tunstall's store, and Tunstall, as I told you, was the Englishman that had been killed that kicked off the war. Firing opened up from the corral. And Sheriff Brady, who was closest to the corral, was hit by 3 shots, head, back, left side. He died instantly. George Hinman was hit by 1 shot. He stumbled a few steps, and fell, mortally wounded. As he was dying, he screamed out, begging for a glass of water. Now, this is not that uncommon in the West. Does anyone know why he would be screaming for a glass of water? Well, it's a fact that if you're bleeding very badly, you get an intense thirst in your throat. And if you look at these accounts of people that were killed in the early West and so on, there's a number of these instances. And the person doesn't realize that they're essentially bleeding out. But you get this immense thirst in your throat, and calling for a glass of water was quite common. And so we know from this that he was bleeding very badly. Now, after Brady and Hinman had been shot and the other deputies ran for cover, Billy the Kid and a man named French ran out. And Billy was trying to recover his Winchester rifle, which Sheriff Brady had confiscated about 2 weeks earlier. And it's a very complicated story. I covered it in great detail in my books. But anyway, he was trying to recover that weapon, and so he ran out. He was observed. They recognized the two. French was actually wounded slightly. Some sources say it was Billy, but it was not Billy. It was French that was wounded. They were unsuccessful in recovering the weapon, and then they ran back behind the corral. Now, what's interesting is that both sides had warrants for the other side. Billy's side had warrants from the Justice of the Peace to arrest the other party on sight, and basically the right to shoot him if they resisted arrest. And the other side, which is normally known as the Santa Fe Ring or the Murphy-Dolan side, they had warrants from the sheriff to arrest Billy and his people. And so both sides had legal cause to arrest the others, and they had the legal right to shoot if there was resistance. Now, they didn't even bother to try to see whether there was resistance. They'd been shooting at each other for about 6 weeks on sight. This is a cartoon that came out about the time of about the Santa Fe Ring. And this was a group that completely controlled the economic and the political, controlled New Mexico economically, politically, financially. And there was a small group opposing them. They were Republicans. Republicans controlled the state at the time. One of the leaders of the Santa Fe Ring had fought for the Confederacy, so that's why you see here a little bit about the Confederate record. But the rest of them, of course, had all been, if they'd fought in the Civil War, they'd fought for the Union. Three-headed snake. Okay, this is very, very valuable. This is one of the very few and the most detailed eyewitness account of the shooting. And so I'm going to read this to you. On the morning of April 1st, about 9 o'clock, I heard shooting, but did not give it much thought until someone came by the house with the news that Sheriff Brady had been killed. I left my work and went into town. I saw Major Brady lying on his back in the street, dead, all covered with blood, and one of the deputies, George Hinman, lying mortally wounded a few yards further along the street. Now remember, his father was one of the deputies. My father was alive, but had had a narrow escape. Now this is Juan Pepin, and he's about 12 when this happens. From hearing him tell about it, I'm able to give what happened. They were walking down the street and had just passed the gateway to the corral when 5 or 6 McSween men fired at them from behind the adobe wall of the corral. Now this is very important. They had drilled portholes in the east wall of the corral so that they could level their rifles through them. So they shot through these portholes. Nobody saw who was firing the weapons. Nobody knew who had killed Brady and Hinman. All they knew was who was present. So these are the key facts of the trial. The corral wall was over 9 feet tall, so they couldn't shoot over the top of it. Now there was a gate, and some sources say that they fired through the gate, but this eyewitness account says no, and later on the sheriff found that there were portholes drilled in the wall, and it makes sense, of course, that they wouldn't reveal themselves. Although there were witnesses who saw Brady and Hinman shot, no one saw who fired the shots that killed them. There were 8 men behind the corral wall at the time of the shooting. Only 3 of them were indicted, Billy and 2 of his companions. After the shootings, it was found that portholes had been drilled in the corral wall at the place where the shots were fired from. And then we just read Juan Pepin's statement. So there's at least 2 very good sources for the portholes. Now this is all new information, by the way, that I dug up from my book. This shows later on in Lincoln approximately where the firing came from. You can see that the wall, the adobe wall, is not 9 feet tall. But there's a number of primary sources that say it was 9 feet tall. So what's happened to it, I don't know. That's Lincoln, of course. Now, in the first charge for murdering Buckshot Roberts, like I say, that was dismissed. His lawyer for that was Ira Leonard. That's a picture of him. And then, of course, we all know Colonel Fountain. If you lived in this area very long, Colonel Fountain defended Billy in his trial for the killing of Sheriff Brady. And I go into it in a lot more detail in the book than we can here, and I conclude in the end that Colonel Fountain did not do a very good job of defending him. This is Judge Warren Briscoe. He was a member of the Santa Fe Ring. He was incredibly biased individual. And as you'll see, he manipulated the trial so that Billy would be convicted. He also approved the change of venue, which was extremely rare in the territory at the time. And the letter that he received from the prosecuting attorney says, "We know he will be acquitted if he's tried in Lincoln." So right there, they're doing it for biased reasons. Again, this is a drawing by my friend Joe Lopez, one of his wonderful drawings. You can see Colonel Fountain there standing. You can see Judge Bristol writing something down. You can see Billy the Kid. You can see the sheriff. That'd be Sheriff Southwick. And then you can see the jury sitting in the first 2 rows of benches. And that's going to be in the courthouse, of course. So now we get to the trial. The court session opened April 1st, and there was a bunch of business. There were actually 3 other men charged with murder. 2 of them were convicted, and they were eventually hung. Billy's case for killing Brady came up on August 8th. He was tried the next day. Of course, he pleaded not guilty. He did not testify in his own defense, and he had no witnesses to testify for him. He was found guilty of murder in the 1st degree. The law required automatic hanging in 30 days for that conviction. The law at the time recognized 5 degrees of murder. Murder 1, or 1st degree murder, was if you were convicted, was automatic hanging in 30 days. Now, the Supreme Court of the territory met twice a year. Lots of times you could be convicted of murder and the Supreme Court would not meet for 3 months from then. So you had no chance to appeal. So the process was you appealed to the governor for a stay of execution long enough to appeal your case. Well, in this particular case, the governor denied the stay. So Billy had no chance to appeal. Now, he had grounds for appeal, and I go into that in my book. However, at the time, the territory did not pay a lawyer to do your appeal. They would pay a lawyer for your defense. Billy was penniless. Fountain was paid to defend him. Fountain refused to appeal the case without pay. Billy had no money. He had a horse that had been confiscated that he tried to get the money for. He was never able to do that. Eventually, the court did award the money to him, but by that time he was dead. But so he had grounds for appeal, very good grounds, but he had no opportunity for appeal. Now, there were 2 conditions had to be satisfied to convict someone of first-degree murder. All the other degrees of murder were just prison time. Like second degree was about 14 years or so of prison time, and that would have been an appropriate sentence for Billy probably. But it had to be, the difference between first degree and all the other degrees was premeditation. It had to be premeditation, and of course you had to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt that the person had done it. Now, motive played no part in the law back then, and in fact it didn't anywhere in the United States at the time. It didn't in English common law. It didn't matter why you did it. Of course, motive now is essential and critical in any kind of legal proceedings, criminal proceedings. So now this is how Judge Bristol manipulated the trial. Now the jurors were all Hispanic. When I've got the records for the selection of the juries, and every time there was an Anglo came up in the voir dire, Colonel Fountain objected to him. And he obviously felt like his best chance of getting an acquittal for his client was an all-Hispanic jury. So the other side didn't care. So he ended up with an all-Hispanic jury. Half of them could not read or write, according to the census records. Almost none of them spoke English very well. So the proceedings of the trial were translated. Now, one of the few comments that the newspaper makes is the translation was terrible. So the people who were going to make this judgment, the jury, were only hearing the evidence and the arguments as it was being translated by a poor translator. So these are the instructions. This is part of the instructions that Judge Bristol gave to the jury. He gave them to the jury in English, and they could not read English, and some of them couldn't read Spanish. Now, shortly after Billy was convicted, this occurred in another trial, and the person was convicted of first-degree murder, and they appealed on this grounds that the instructions were in English only, given to the jury only in English. They didn't read English. Nevertheless, that was denied. But that would have been one of the grounds on which Billy had a legitimate appeal. So here's what the judge said. The first one is addressing premeditation. These are the direct quote. As to this premeditation design, I charge you that to render a design to kill premeditated, it is of necessity that such design to kill should exist in the mind. It is not necessary that such design to kill should exist in the mind for any considerable length of time before the killing. If the design to kill is completely formulated in the mind, but for a moment before inflicting the fatal wounds, it would be premeditated, and in law, the effect would be the same as though the design to kill had existed for a long time. Now, with this definition, any crime is premeditated. Half a second, split second, in a motion, if you make that decision in a split second, by this definition, it's premeditated. Now, that's one of the 2 requirements of the law. Now, remember, he's giving these very complicated instructions to a jury in English that does not understand English well at all. And now, as to whether or not he did it, whether beyond a reasonable doubt, here's the instructions he gave to the jury. And these are really something. If Billy was present, encouraging, inciting, aiding in, abetting, advising, or commanding the killing of Brady, He is as much guilty as though he fired the fatal shot. Now remember, nobody who was behind the wall testified in the trial. No one saw who fired the shots. This is just smoke and mirrors. The only thing you could say is that Billy was present because he did run out. But just being present at a crime is not enough to be convicted. And that's why he added all these other adjectives, and they're just in there to confuse the jury. Aided, abetted, commanded. In order to prove any of those, you have to have a witness testify that he was behind the corral wall and he heard Billy aiding or abetting. And of course, there was no such witness. So these were the instructions the judge gave the jury to satisfy those two requirements of the law. And on top of that, the law required that the jury could decide the punishment or decide the degree of crime, first through fifth degree murder. And the judge also told them they could only consider first degree or acquittal. Like I say, second degree was probably the appropriate charge, but they weren't allowed to consider anything but first degree, which was automatic hanging, or acquittal. So this is an extremely blatant example of manipulating the jury. And whatever you may think of Billy the Kid, he did some things that were bad, and nevertheless, everybody's entitled to a fair trial. There were, in the Lincoln County War, it's estimated there were 80 murders. There were about 200 men involved on both sides. 80 men were murdered. Only one person was ever tried, and that was Billy. He was the only one. The new governor came into town. He gave a blanket amnesty, no matter what your crime. All these people that murdered various people, they pled the amnesty, but the judge put a date on it, and the starting date was just happened to be after Billy had killed Brady. And the judge also, the governor also said that if you had been indicted already, it didn't apply. And Billy and his two friends were the only ones that had been indicted already. So he's the only one that paid any price for all these murders, for anything that happened in the Lincoln County War. So Billy was convicted in Mesilla. The territorial law required that you be hung in the location, the county in which the crime occurred. Of course, Mesilla is in Donana County. So they had to take him to Lincoln to be hung. And, that's what they did. They took him to Lincoln. And of course, as you know, he was held in the courthouse there. The jail was just a room on the top story of the courthouse. He was able to escape. And, of course, Pat Garrett killed him at Fort Sumner. This is the courthouse. You can see the little X there on the left. When one of the men that took him to Mesilla was a man named Ollinger, which they were very bitter enemies. They had a long history. And when Billy escaped, he shot and killed Ollinger from that window with Ollinger's own shotgun. He killed two men in escaping. He killed a man named Bell, and he killed Ollinger. People used to say, oh, Billy Kid has killed 21 people. Well, not true. He only killed 5, including these 2. The other 3 were all self-defense, in essence, certainly justifiable by the law at the time. These are the 2 in which he crosses the line. So the reason that people still think about Billy the Kid is because he's an existential hero. He was completely railroaded by the legal system. He may have been guilty, but he was completely railroaded by the legal system, and he's in this existential dilemma. How far are you willing to go to save your own life? Think about the situation we have today where we have a war going on, people are being killed. All over the world, throughout time, people have faced this dilemma where they've been unjustly prosecuted by authorities, and the question that a person always has is, how far are you willing to go to save your own life? Well, Billy was willing to kill 2 innocent people to do it, and of course, we're not willing to do that, but that is the essence of the existential question. Do you kill a prison guard to escape because you've been unjustly jailed? And this is a colorized photograph of the location in Fort Sumner where Billy was killed. And I'm sure you probably are aware with this, but it was in the front left corner that Pete Maxwell had his bedroom, and he came into that bedroom when Pat Garrett was in there, and Pat Garrett shot him. So another drawing by Joe.